So thank you very much for the kind introductions and the invitation to speak to you in Bangkok like that. If we were to stop all CO2 emissions today on our whole planet, we would still have that CO2 for at least 800 years in the atmosphere and it would have its cascading effects. So it is very clear that climate change will take a dramatic course and that all human beings in the future, perhaps all of you in this room, will increasingly experience themselves as failing beings. As beings, does this microphone still work? It sounds like it's going on and off. But most of you in this room are very young. It's going to be with you the rest of your life. And it's going to get stronger. And the experience will be to be a human being is to be somebody who's not able to act solidarity in global solidarity. The second thing in which the image of man is going to greatly change, and it will also change your self-experience, is what I call the naturalistic turn in the image of man. Neuroscience, genetics are now very clearly understanding not only the history of our bodies, of our phenotypical properties, but also psychological properties, consciousness, cognition, the human mind are now increasingly understood, described, and explained as natural properties, as a target for the hard sciences. And we come to view not only our bodies and our eyes and our ears, but our minds as products of evolution, of a process that had no goal and no direction. So this turn in the image of man as an entirely natural being with a natural history, in a way cuts off the divine root, as some eminent German neuroscientists once said, of human beings. It will change our image of ourselves. It's not clear what it does to us, but there are these two parallel developments running, and they will also change the way in which we experience ourselves. And that is why I want to ask the question, is there a modern form of spirituality? Is it possible in this historical transition phase? How does one live with this information? Is it possible not to lose one's self-respect, even if humanity as a whole may fail? How can you live as an individual person without sliding off into irrationality? I have to ask, from my point of view, the microphone is constantly going on and off. Is this happening for you too?
Yes.
Yeah. In a dramatic historical transition, you are going to live through it with your whole life. And the question is there anything left from old-fashioned religion, old-fashioned metaphysical images of man, or will all this be just washed away by the life sciences, by modern neuropsychology, and so forth? I want to ask three very simple questions. This is not a technical lecture. As you may hear afterwards, I'm giving 3 other lectures in Bangalore on this afternoon. If you're more scientifically interested, this is very simple and accessible, but still, I want to ask 3 questions and give 3 answers. I want to ask, what is spirituality? I want to ask, what is intellectual honesty? And of course, being a philosopher, I'm interested if there's an intimate conceptual connection between those 2 attitudes towards reality and one's own mind. I also want to defend 3 theses, and I'm very happy to discuss them with you. The first claim I want to make is the opposite of religion is not science, but spirituality. Spirituality is the opposite of religion. The ethical principle of intellectual honesty can be analyzed as a special case of the spiritual stance. And in their purest forms, the scientific and the spiritual stance emerge from exactly the same basic normative ideal, from the same value. So let us look at this. Let us begin by asking, what is spirituality? I have looked into many different traditions in the East and in the West, spiritual traditions, and try to find if there's something that they all share, if they try to define spirituality. And as you will see, one could ask the question, is spirituality a property of states of consciousness? For instance, in meditation, you could say there are spiritual states of consciousness, or perhaps spiritual brain states even. But here I want to look at it as a property of persons, and ask the question, what does it mean that a person is a spiritual person? I don't know if you consider yourself as spiritual persons. The first thing one finds is an epistemic stance. Spiritual people are people who want to know something. Episteme is the Greek word for knowledge. Spiritual people are interested in a special form of knowledge and not in believing in something. Now if one asks, okay, what is this that spiritual people, say in India, or Middle Age mystics in the Christian tradition in Europe, or North American Indians, what is it that they want to know? Then the first thing you find is there is never a clear concept what the object of knowledge is. It gets fuzzy, it gets contradictory, there are no clear conceptualizations, but they resemble the knowledge that religion and metaphysics used to search for in the past. It's completely unclear if something like a method of the spiritual stance exists. Some people say you have to meditate for many years. You need formal practice. Other people will say it is exactly that thing which cannot be practiced. It's exactly that thing for which no method exists, no teachers exist. I think in practice, both things are equally true, but in theory, there is a very obvious contradiction there. So let's move on. So, spirituality is an epistemic sense of person where the important form of knowledge is non-theoretical. They all agree that it has nothing to do with finding the right kind of theory and defending that that theory is true. It's non-propositional. Spiritual knowledge is something that does not have the form of sentences. It doesn't have the form of true sentences, and it also doesn't have the form of thoughts. It's non-cognitive in the sense that it is not a question of thinking the right kind of things. It's rather the end of all thought. And many spiritual traditions of mankind agree that spiritual knowledge is a non-discursive kind of knowledge. What does that mean? It means that this is something you cannot properly discuss or talk about it. It's not something that you can drag into the space of public discourse. But it is always a form of self-knowledge. Spiritual people seek a certain kind of knowledge about themselves, but it is a special form. It has to do with their own existence, and it is transformative. That is, those who have attained spiritual knowledge have become whole, have become integrated, have become more complete than they were before. So there's always an element of self-perfection and self-completion in very different traditions through spiritual knowledge. Now, you know, I'm a professor of philosophy. If one looks at this from my perspective, this is almost nothing. This is a very weak concept of knowledge. We really don't know much about what spiritual knowledge is. Let us take two examples. So in my own tradition in Europe, for instance, you had the Bishop of Paris, who was born about 1180, writing the following things. Spirituality is the perfection by which we first of all ward off from our souls spiritual evils which are vices and sins. By this spirituality we likewise seek for our souls spiritual goods, which are all virtues and gifts of the graces. So for the Christian philosophers, for the Latin philosophers, there were logical oppositions. spiritualia, that is the Latin word, were the opposite of temporalia. Temporal things are church offices and offices of the clergy that are in time. Spiritual affairs are the things that are not in time. Another important opposition was spiritualitas and carnalitas. Carnalitas meaning the flesh and the biological body. So spirituality in human beings, in spiritual persons, is exactly that which has nothing to do with your biological body, with the weakness of the flesh. And the third important opposition in centuries of Western philosophy was spiritualitas and brutalitas. Brutalitas is what the brutes have. It's the property of the animals. And the idea is spirituality is what no animal on this planet has, which only human beings have. So one of the results of the original sin is brutalitas, which subjects man to his animal instincts. If you're not spiritual, you're becoming closer and closer to animal. This was the traditional idea. And brutalitas is the exact opposite of spirituality. Now let us look at another example. So I just learned that this institution was founded by Annie Besson. We're probably going to visit the Rishi Valley School tomorrow. The first time I came to India in my life, 30 years ago, when I was a young student like you, I went to Madras because I wanted to listen to the talks of J. Krishnamurti. I had listened to him in Switzerland for many years, but I had to see how he talks to his own people. So that's when I came to India first. And he has a much more interesting definition of what spirituality is. He says, "For I maintain that the only spirituality is the incorruptibility of the self, which is eternal as the harmony between reason and love." And I think that, from a philosophical perspective, is a more interesting concept of what spirituality is. Incorruptibility. And you know that many countries on the world, mine only included, have big problems with corruption right now. The problem is, corruption is also a mental property. If you don't face corruption in your own mind, you can never eradicate it in society. And that is why I think this is very important. So maybe you remember, maybe some of you know, that J. Krishnamurti was hailed as the Maitreya, as the coming world teacher, and that the first thing he did was in 1929 to dissolve the order that was founded for him, his own church, so to speak, to disseminate his teachings, and he said that spirituality is incorruptibility of the self. We're coming already to the second part. This will be a little bit longer. What is intellectual honesty? Again, let's start with the working definition. Say intellectual honesty is a property of persons, and we can discuss later on if you are intellectually honest, if I'm intellectually honest. So it's an ethical attitude towards inner action, not towards bodily action. An intellectually honest person tries to be ethical with regard to what he thinks or what she believes. It's a form of moral integrity, but it has nothing to do with outer behavior. It refers to the way, that is a technical term from philosophy, how you regulate your own beliefs. What you believe and what you give up. Philosophers call it narcissistic autoregulation, but don't worry about the term. So intellectually honest people are people who try to have a maximum coherence between what they know and what they believe. That is why they only want to have evidence-based beliefs. This is where science comes in. And they don't want a kind of thinking that only makes you feel good. Maybe you have already noticed that religion often serves emotional needs. It's not about knowing something. It's about feeling secure, or He that believes without having any reason for believing may be in love with his own fancies, but neither seeks truth as he ought, nor pays the obedience due to his Maker. Who would have him use those discerning faculties that he has given him to keep him out of mistake and error? So here in the very beginning, to be intellectually honest is an obligation towards God. And the interesting point is, God does not want you to believe in him. God wants you to try to know him. And it is your obligation not to believe in him, but to try to experience him. You see this? This is how it started in the history of Western thought. Now let's look at the second definition, Immanuel Kant, in this important book, Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason, says the following: intellectual honesty is the sincere intention of being honest towards oneself. That is something very simple, actually. And it's about the purity of the intention. And maybe you have noticed, this is something no guru can teach you. Either you want to be honest to yourself, and you're sincere, or you're not. This is something you can learn in no college in the world, not to lie to yourself. Nobody sees it. You cannot pretend it or fake it. It's deeply inside of you. Either you want to be honest to yourself or not. Kant even said that this is actually the moral good in its absolute purity. That is the essence of trying to be a morally good human being, is the honest intention to not fool oneself and to be honest to oneself. Kant also said what it means to be intellectually dishonest. He said it means to have an inner lie, and that is a lack of truthfulness and sincerity towards yourself. And interestingly, he said, to be like that is like being unconscious in a certain way. Not to have this conscientiousness towards oneself is like sleeping. Man's duty to himself, regarded merely as a moral being, is truthfulness. So here the idea is you have a moral duty not only to other human beings, but to yourself. And the moral duty you have to yourself is not to lie to yourself. Kant then said, insincerity is mere lack of conscientiousness, that is, of purity in one's professions before one's inner judge. There's not only an outer judge, but there's also an inner judge. Okay. Milestone 3. A grandiose German philosopher by the name of Friedrich Nietzsche. He said you have to have the unconditional will to truth. Where my honesty ceases, I am blind and also want to be blind. But where I want to know, I also want to be honest, namely venomous, rigorous, vigorous, cruel, and inexorable. So for him, intellectual honesty is the very last stage in the Greek, Western history of philosophy, right? It's the self-annihilation of the religious moral interpretation of the will to truth. So the idea is, if you become more and more honest to yourself, you can admit to yourself that you don't know if God exists. And you give up the religious belief, the religious metaphysical interpretation of the will to truth. So it develops in stages, and the last and the highest stage is to let go of the belief in God. You see a very radical philosopher. Here's the fourth example I've brought to you. In the Anglo-Saxon tradition, things were often more clear and simple. William Kingdon Clifford lived from 1845 to 1879, He was a mathematician and a philosopher, and he wrote a very important book, The Ethics of Belief. And he made many people think about it, that there's an ethical issue also about what you believe and what you don't believe. So I've brought two very simple principles for you. The first thing is that it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. Do you agree? Is it wrong for you, everywhere and at any time in your life, to believe anything on insufficient evidence? The second principle he proposed was, at any time, at any place, and for every person, it is equally wrong to ignore or carelessly reject the relevant evidence for one's own beliefs. That is, one needs to be scientifically informed. And people who do not face criticism and things that might contradict their own views are, as he put it, sinning against mankind. Their whole life is a sin, not against God, but against mankind. So now, this may have been a bit too philosophical for you. I want to bring 3 examples and ask the question, in 2030, today, what does it mean to be intellectually honest? Let's make it concrete, right? Not too romantic philosophy. So the first example I want to look at for 5 minutes is religion. The second example I want to look at is the belief in life after death. And the third example is the concept of enlightenment, which you know very well from your own tradition. So let's look at it. After 2,500 years of Western history of philosophy, there is no convincing argument for God's existence. Of course, there are very few philosophers who say something else, and I respect them. But this is a simple fact we have to face. Philosophers have tried to prove the existence of God, and they have failed. All known proofs of God's existence fail. And then there is this possibility of agnosticism that many people like to take. I will not make a judgment. I will not either say God exists or God doesn't exist. But that is not so easy if one takes a closer look. Why is it not easy? Because the burden of proof is on the theist, on the person who wants to claim that God exists. It's very uneven. So think about the Easter bunny, right? If somebody says, come on, the Easter bunny doesn't exist, it doesn't really work to say, I'm an Easter bunny agnosticist, you know. Maybe it exists, maybe it doesn't exist. The burden of proof is all on one side. What about empirical research? Very obviously, that's a trivial point. There is no empirical evidence for the existence of God. But nobody really expected this. However, there is something new right now in our time. There is an increasing number of convincing theories of the evolution of religiousness. Why do animals not have religion? How did it evolve in human beings? Evolutionary psychology is giving us the very first theories of the development of metaphysical belief systems. Religion is currently being naturalized. There are research programs all over the world trying to understand how religion came about. So here's one example. Daniel Dennett is the most famous living philosopher of consciousness. And here's a recent paper in a scientific journal. You may know the paper on Mainz, brain sciences. I'm not going to go into any details, but these leading experts discuss the evolution of misbelief. How is it possible that animals and human beings evolved false beliefs that are absurdly false and kept on? Maybe some of the biologists here know Robert Trivers, one of the most famous theoretical biologists. Here you see another paper from 2011. these people are now very carefully researching the evolution of self-deception in the animal kingdom and in human beings. And it turns out to be self-deceived, to have self-deceptions, is very advantageous. I'll give you two examples. If you're an animal and you're a male, and you want to fight another male, in the moment when you threaten the other male, you have to be slightly delusional. You have to believe that you are stronger. Because if you give any subliminal signals with your body that you're not so sure who is stronger here, you will have no children, right, in evolution. Because the other guy looks, how certain is he really that he's stronger than me? So there are many examples in the animal kingdom where animals self-deceive and become more efficient through self-deception. Take another example, think you are a politician and you have to lie to thousands of people all the time. And human beings are very good cheating detectors. They look, is this guy cheating? How does he move? How does he stand? How does he move his fingers? The best thing is if you go into a mildly delusional state while you give a public speech and actually believe it yourself. Because then you look coherent. So there's now a lot of new knowledge about natural selection and self-deception. And this leading scientist says the conventional view that natural selection favors nervous systems which produce ever more accurate images of the world must be a very naive view of mental evolution. New research shows that in many cases there was an evolution of systematic mental misrepresentations of reality. 75% of all car drivers think that they are better than average car drivers. If you take only those car drivers that have caused four serious accidents, they still believe that they are better than average car drivers. All college professors think that they are better than the average. Something all human beings have is optimism bias. They all think their future is going to be better than it really will be. So there is an evolution of self-deception, and in many cases, positive illusions, denial and repression and delusion enhance the reproductive success of our biological ancestors. Now, why is that important? The central problem for our own species is the explicit and consciously experienced insight into our own mortality. We are the only animal that really knows it will die. The other animals on the planet are not aware of this. This is a problem. It's a major problem for us. We have to adapt to this because for many people they experience it as devaluating their own life. So the idea is that religion had something to do with this. Now, one concept I've coined is adaptive delusional systems. This is not provocative, I'm very serious about this. So, human beings, as opposed to animals, have four belief systems, ideologies, but also religions, that help them adapt to the knowledge that they will die. Religions, such delusional systems, helped keeping large groups together. They stabilized internal hierarchies, gurus, church hierarchies. And they may, as many researchers today say, be functionally adequate forms of self-deception. Now here you see two representatives from my own culture of adaptive delusional systems. You see Pope Pius and Adolf Hitler. Now, National Socialism in my country was like a religion. It was like a national awakening. This system is now surviving for 2,000 years. This guy also wanted to found the Third Reich, was supposed to last for 1,000 years, but it only lasted 12 years. What is the difference between those two systems? The one had a story to tell about why you will not die and why there will be life after death, and the other did not have a mechanism to help people deny their own mortality. mortality. So the idea is that religion evolved out of burial rites, burial objects, and an ancestor cult, and that one of the most important functions of religion is to deny your own mortality, to deny the fact that you will die. Now, one thing is important. You do not have to believe this. These are theories, these theories may be false. I'm not saying this is the truth. We are talking about intellectual honesty. Intellectual honesty only means to face the fact that today the best scientists are talking about things like that. That is what is needed for intellectual honesty, not to believe it. Let's take the second example, life after death. In my own discipline, in philosophy of mind, nobody endorses the position of substance dualism. There are very, very few philosophers in the Western tradition who think that there could actually be a soul that survives the body after death. There are some. And the interesting thing is, I tell you, it's horrible to be a philosopher as a job, because philosophers never agree on anything. But about that, they agree very much. There are about 9 different theories after World War II to solve the mind-body problem, the relationship between brain and consciousness. But none of them, even those who say mind cannot be reduced to the brain, there's a separate kind of properties, none of them argue for personal survival after death. So even those people who say there's something irreducible beyond physics, chemistry, and biology and neurobiology, they don't believe in personal survival after death. Now here is my own field of research. 17 years ago I founded with a number of people the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. You've been at MIT, so there's one MIT press book in 2000 you can look at. It's called Neural Projects of Consciousness. I know most of the leading consciousness researchers in the world for many years. Almost nobody of them believes that you can have conscious experiences after the brain is dead. Right? A functioning brain seems to be a necessary condition for conscious states to arise. Many people, although they have different opinions, believe that as soon as all the properties of your brain are fixed, also all of the properties of your conscious mind are determined. We call this upward determination. And what researchers do is they try to find the neural correlate of consciousness. That is, they try to find those properties in the brain that directly correlate with conscious experience. That is the frontier of research in consciousness research. There's nobody who really thinks that without the NCC for seeing colors, you could still see colors after death. And that without the NCC for emotional consciousness, you could still have feelings after death. And that without the NCC for cognition, you could still think thoughts. So it seems that it is becoming very implausible that there could be consciousness after death. And again, let me repeat this. I am not saying this is true. The point is not that these theories are true. Intellectual honesty just means to face the facts that the best of science currently is saying something like this. It may be false, but one has to face the facts. Now about our third example. What is enlightenment? Spiritual people talk a lot about enlightenment. The man you see here is Robert Sharp. He's the director of the Center for Buddhist Studies at the University of Berkeley, San Francisco in California. He has been in Myanmar many years meditating as a monk. He knows everything you can know about Buddhist philosophy, 2,500 years. He has studied all the scriptures in the original languages. He speaks the original languages. And he has meditated for many years. There's something I have learned from this man. There's only one group of human beings on the planet Earth who knows what enlightenment is. And these are Westerners who go to New Age bookstores, in Germany or in America. full consensus. There's only one kind of people who know very well what enlightenment is. And if you come to Germany, I can show you some of them. Those are people who come to India to satisfy their emotional needs by exploiting other cultures. So let's look at this. Is it, on a conceptual level, possible to say that there are good arguments that there is a single state of consciousness which is well defined, which is the same in all cultures, in India, America, 1,000 years ago, now, which is independent of the theories you have, and independent of the descriptions you give, and that is the enlightenment? There are just no arguments for that there is one common state. If you look at the description Christian mystics give of their enlightenment experiences, they are different if you look carefully. It's not all the same. Yeah, they talk about ego death and dissolving of the ego, but if you look more carefully, they depend on what they believed in. So, one thing I'm very happy about this is that there's an excellent new wave of meditation research now. Neuroscientists in the West are investigating Tibetan monks with a very long meditation history. And there's really good natural science meditation research. But could meditation research show that there's one state in the brain that is the same for everybody in India and America 1,000 years ago, Buddhists, Christians, independent of the theory of enlightenment you have, independent of the description? I think it's impossible. You cannot show this by empirical science that enlightenment exists. It's a misguided idea. So again, you don't have to believe this. But this is, I think, the state of affairs, and to be intellectually honest, one has to admit that we don't really know what enlightenment is. Probably nobody knows it. I come to the end of this lecture already. So can we bring the two things together in the third part? Is there a connection between a spiritual person and being an intellectual, honest person? These were the three questions at the beginning. Do you still remember the questions? Let's try if we have answers to them now. The three theses, where the opposite of religion is not science but spirituality. Intellectual honesty is a special case of the spiritual stars. And in their purest forms, the scientific and the spiritual stance are based on the same value. So let's look at it. What does it mean to say that religion is the opposite of spirituality? Let's compare religion and spirituality. If these modern researchers are right, then religion is the cultivation of a delusional system. The technical philosophy, the term in philosophy, is fideism. Fideism means you can believe in what you want to believe, even if there are good counter-arguments and opposing empirical evidence. You can go on believing it. That's the foundation of religion. Spirituality aims at insight, not at believing something. Religion wants to maximize good feelings. You want to feel at home in the world. You want to have a deep sense of meaning. You want to feel emotionally secure. Spiritual people do not do that. They search for direct experience of God. Religious people sacrifice their own rationality because they want to have an emotionally coherent self-model. Spiritual people do something else. They dissolve the conscious self altogether. Anatta, they try to dissolve the sense of self. Religion is dogmatic. Dogmatism is also a technical concept from philosophy. Dogmatism means you can hold on to a belief just because you already have it. It's a very simple philosophical position. We've always believed this, and we are permitted to keep on holding on to this. That is intellectually dishonest. Spirituality has the ideal of truthfulness and sincerity. Spiritual people will always be open for rational arguments. Religion organizes itself, as you all know. Spirituality is a radically individual thing. I think, as for instance, J. Krishnamurti said, there's nothing you can organize. I don't know if you're interested in this, but I have bad news for you. If you are interested in a spiritual life, the bad news is you are alone. Absolutely alone. Nobody can help you with this. Religion evangelizes. Truly spiritual people are quiet. They don't talk about it in the marketplaces. Now let's look at the second thesis. I said intellectual honesty is actually a form of spirituality. Now that might sound strange to you, but maybe some of you have known real scientists, real researchers. And if you've known them, you may have realized they are often really spiritual people. If you tell them, they say, no, I'm a scientist, they don't have nothing to do with it. But the determination is exactly that. Let's look at it. Spirituality aims at insight and has an unconditional will to knowledge. Science has a rational methodology and maximizes growth of knowledge. Spirituality searches for direct experience. Science is data-driven, does experiments, and searches for empirical evidence. Spirituality dissolves the self. Science tries to refute its own theories. I will come back to this in a minute. The essence of science is not to prove that your own theory is true, but to make it fail through a new experiment. That is what the essence of science is. So spiritual people are open for rational arguments, and scientific people operate under what philosophers call the principle of parsimony. That means you minimize your assumptions about the world. If you have two theories, T1 and T2, and they explain the same area of reality, one theory that makes weaker assumptions is the better theory. That's the principle of science. Spirituality is radically individual, but science, of course, is a big organized enterprise around the world. Scientists also disseminate their knowledge. They go to television, they write popular books. So here is one example of the spiritual stance in philosophy of science. How many of you have ever heard the name Karl Popper? Do you know him? One of the most famous philosophers of science in the 20th century. And he had this beautiful thought is if you want to know what reality is, if you want to touch reality as a scientist, you touch it in the moment when your theory fails. If you have a hypothesis, and you make an experiment, and the experiment shows your hypothesis is false, that's when you touch reality. Not when you try to prove it. There are no black swans, all swans are white. We've counted 1 million swans, they're all white. When you find the first black swan and find out the theory was false, then you touch reality, right? So he was a defender of a position that was called critical rationalism. And let's look at that because that's very interesting. So he said, I am not prepared to accept anything that cannot be defended by means of argument or experience. That's the principle of rationalism, right? Rationalists think like that. Now he commented, now it is easy to see that this principle of an uncritical rationalism is inconsistent. For since it cannot in its turn be supported by argument or experience, it implies that it should itself be discarded. That is the spiritual stance in science. Do you understand it? This is trying to prevent rationalism from becoming a religion. He always pointed out that he was a rationalist and a scientist, but that it was important to see that you cannot base the decision for rationalism on any scientific evidence. It's a decision, right? Let's look at the last claim. So I said in their purest forms, the scientific and the spiritual stance emerged from the same basic normative idea. What is that? Now here we have to differentiate something, and in 5 minutes we are finished. So I think there are two kinds of action. That's the first thing we have to understand. You can act with the physical body, you can walk and talk. You can also act with your mind, and that is what is important. One way to act with your mind is to close your eyes and think logically, or to calculate. 2 + 3 is 5. Another way of mental action is planning, visualizing, actively imagining something. You're just acting with your brain, so to speak. But then there is a third and very important form of mental action, and that is meditation practice. If you think of, say, classical vipassana, form of meditation practice, to see that you've had a thought and to return to the breath and let the thought go, that is an act. To stop the mind wandering and return to the breath in its simplest form, that's a form of mental action too. But it has nothing to do with thinking. It has to do with controlling attention and acting with attention, with the mind beam of attention, so to speak. So the question we have to ask at the end of this talk is there an ethics for mental action? Everybody talks about what good physical actions are. You should not kill other people, you should donate to the poor, you should do this, you should do that. But is there an ethics for how you think? And an ethics for how you attend as well? So there are the two main types of mental action. You can form a concept. There is enlightenment. I believe in God. You can make a belief your own. These people say God exists. I make that belief my own. From now on, I will believe God exists. That's a form of mental action. Then there's a completely different form of mental action. Act with your attention. You can concentrate. But then there's also what people like Jiva Krishnamurti, for instance, call choiceless awareness. Of simply observing without an observer and letting go. And I think this is not something I have to explain in this country, because you know much better what I'm talking about. Now the point I just want to make is that there is a single ethical attitude that connects those both kinds of interaction. The attempt to think in an intellectual, honest way and meditation practice. It is exactly based on the same ethical attitudes. And that attitude has two aspects. The will to truth. If you think rationally, if you're a scientist or if you're a Buddhist monk that meditates, your goal is insight. Your goal is not to believe in something. You want to find out what the truth is. So you both have the normative ideal of absolute truthfulness. The physics professor has that, and the meditating monk has that, if he's a monk and not just a religious person. Now you have to turn that will to truth towards yourself. The unconditional will to truthfulness towards oneself. That is what connects the scientific and the spiritual stance. In its purest form, I think you find it, for instance, in the practice of mindfulness meditation in spiritual form practice. Because that can only work with a sincere will to restlessness. If you don't have that, you cannot face it, and you cannot proceed with your spiritual practice. But in the scientific method, you have exactly the same thing. truthfulness toward oneself, but on the level of thinking. And that is the self-critical rationalism of Karl Popper, which I briefly showed you. So we are at the end of this talk, and I think there is actually one ethics of interaction in spiritual practice, like meditation, and in the ideal of intellectual honesty that came out of Western tradition. There are two forms of expanding knowledge: sub-symbolic, without words, concepts, or sentences, in mindfulness and attention, and cognitive in scientific rationality. The only point I'm trying to make today that I would like to discuss with you is I think you cannot have one without the other. And almost all people only have one of the two things. But we may actually need both, because ultimately you cannot be a really critical, rational person without having a spiritual practice. And you cannot have a true spiritual practice without intellectual honesty, because then you slide off into religion. Thank you very much for your